Um, Danielle Clarke is professor of Renaissance language and literature at University College Dublin. She has published widely on gender, sexuality, and women's writing from the early modern period. She has just finished editing, with Sarah C.E.Ross and Elizabeth Scott-Baumann, the Oxford Handbook of Early Modern Women's Writing in English from 1540 to 1680, and a section editor for Theories and Methodologies for the Palgrave Encyclopaedia of Early Modern Women's Writing, edited by Rosalind Smith and Patricia Pender. She's working on an edition of the poetry of Lady Anne Southwell and researching a monograph, Becoming Human, Women's Writing, Time, Nature, and Devotion from 1550 to 1700. And the talk that we're going to hear today is related to that project. So Danielle's presentation will argue that early modern women poets use the account of creation and fall in the book of Genesis to question and unsettle a binary model of gender and gender roles, resisting the biological determinism that later readings embed. So Danielle, over to you.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen there. Everybody see that okay? Well, thank you to everybody for the invitation. It is well after dinner time here. As I was saying to the others, I have just eaten a rather large roast dinner, so the idea that I would engage in abstract thought is possibly a little challenging for me right now. But thank you very much for the invitation, and I've greatly enjoyed the presentations both yesterday and today, which kind of touch on some of the issues I want to talk about in a variety of ways. I was just thinking particularly about, Olivia's ideas about kind of poetry, thinking and philosophy. So a lot of this paper really is kind of asking some questions about the form in which this kind of thinking takes place. And Laura's discussion of the animal and human is also very relevant to what I'm doing here. I'm very taken with Nathan's account of meditation and ideas about meditation. In fact, he's just sort of kind of summed up in 2 sentences the argument of my book, I think. So maybe I should just hand it back to him. And Matt's piece as well. I'm still getting my head around the various configurations of nothings, but I'm very interested in this kind of idea of hermaphroditic figures and spinning and textual work and various other things. So we can try and pull all of those together. I should also say there's very little Cavendish in this paper. In fact, as it turned out, I kind of ran out of time for her. But I'm hoping that in the breakout rooms afterwards, we might talk about the Cavendish poem and how that might relate to some of these questions. So, okay, so this talk then traces a line of thought in relation to the creation of sex and gender roles from Du Bartas through a selection of 17th century women poets. I want to suggest that the dyad of Adam and Eve, both their creation and fall, provides women writers in particular with a powerful authoritative example with which to think through ideas about what sex is, what gender is, and the extent to which these are, in fact, opposites within a binary matrix. Very briefly, I suggest too that observations of the natural world, Du Bartas's Divide Weeks is the ultimate compendium of knowledge, lead women to ask searching questions about the animal-human boundary, which is a key philosophical question, and about the mobilization of this opposition as a way of reinforcing or indeed challenging socially determined gender roles. I have a long kind of preamble about women reading Du Bartas, which I can share with you in another context. The importance of Du Bartas had been almost entirely overlooked subsequent to Anne Lake Prescott and Susan Snyder's pioneering work on his poems in the 1970s and 1980s. C.E.Ross, Gillian Wright, and Elizabeth Scott-Baumann, among others, have noted the importance of Du Bartas to 17th century women devotional poets, with Ross noting, quote, the variety of Du Bartas's influence in the first half of the century. She puts forward a strong case for Du Bartas's direct, if diffuse, influence on women's poetry, asserting that all divine poets of the 17th century owe something to Du Bartas's harnessing of secular verse forms to sacred subject matter. And this reminds me again of Nathan's arguments as, quote, a digressive, copious and various retelling of scripture, providing a framework on which women can structure their own responses. And she demonstrates this specifically in relation to Southwell, Poulter and Hutchinson. Formal imitation is important. We might read Lanier's Salve Deus Rex Judaeorum as a Barthesian poetic commentary on the Gospels, or Southwell's Decalogue poems as imitative of de Bartas, or Bradstreet's imitation of verse forms from Sylvester and her use of the quaternion as manifestation of this engagement. De Bartas is not so much a paraphraser of scripture as a contextualizer and enlarger of it, adding subsequent insight and knowledge to the end of asserting the universal inclusivity of the divine creation. The world, in his famous if conventional formulation, is a book, which directs readers how to interpret the physical world as the manifestation of the divine. So this is from the 7th day of the first week. You actually have this copied out in the pack, which is a little bit easier to read. So here we find a material reading of the earth as, quote, dear mother, which may then be understood to impart key lessons. The natural world provides moral examples for human beings to imitate, a powerful means by which ideas of origin and orientation might be interpreted and understood. Quote, O earth, the treasures of thy hollow breast are no less fruitful teachers than the rest. This framework is crucial then when we turn to readings of the creation of Adam and Eve. Like many early modern accounts, de Bartas frames his reading in terms of sameness, not difference. So there's a little bit here about prelapsarian reproduction as being based in similitude rather than difference. Thenceforth, therefore, bears engender, the dolphins, vultures bred, men, and nature with a changeless course. So men is this sort of weirdly kind of prelapsarian homoerotic idea of creation, which I'll come back to. So the point here is about sameness rather than difference. Adam and Eve are not opposite parts of a dyad, but rather rooted in a common body. And this is, of course, a model of sexual differentiation that's ultimately confirmed by modern science. So here, he took a rib which rarely he refined, and thereof made the mother of mankind. This is it's only identified by female by role, by mother. Adam's beauties, but hardly one could have the lover from his love described, or known the bridegroom from his gentle bride. It's about non-differentiation. And then this is my favorite version of this, where he says, his other self, his help, him to refresh, bone of his bone, flesh of his flesh, source of all joys, sweet he, she, coupled one. And this is de Bartas, or Sylvester's interpretation of de Bartas, with the very powerful hyphenation there as well. So I want to explore briefly the way in which four poets, Lanier, Southwell, Hutchinson, and Cavendish, respond to de Bartas' strongly materialist reading of the scene of the fall, suggesting in turn that this model provides authority for all four poets to question and reframe a reading that depends on sequential hierarchy, namely the notion that Eve is lesser because she is creative after Adam, and secondly, on a fixed gender identity located in the apparent stability of corporeal sex. For Lanier, for example, metaphors of the book as food and ownership of luxury objects abound in Salve Deus Rex Judaeorum, reminding us again of the interpenetration of the material and the human, and the ways in which this serves or may serve to reposition or rethink aspects of the patriarchal gender binary. Lanier's defense of Eve depends crucially on the fact that she is materially identical to Adam. Quote, if any evil did in her remain, being made of him, he was the ground of all. It is post-lapsarian hindsight that introduces the idea of hierarchical differentiation based on sexual difference. Quote, for he was Lord and King of all the earth before poor Eve had either life or breath. And this is an interpretive model also embraced by Southwell and Hutchinson. Lady Anne Southwell asserts that a rigid hierarchy based on gender inequality is, quote, a perverse, resolved and willful heresy. This is my very badly annotated and much used copy here. This is why we need an edition. Her unpicking of the sequential model found in one biblical account is underlined by the way that the poem works backwards through the biblical account, starting with Genesis 2:22 and ending with 1:27. For Milton, of course, these questions of primacy and sequentiality, fused with classical models of sexual difference, trace Eve's secondariness and thus inferiority back to the ontological signifier of the body. By contrast, Southwell focuses on those verses in Genesis which contradict such ideas of temporal primacy and moral secondariness. Woman's origin in this account is identical to that of man, and Southwell suggests that woman is the perfection of man. Questions of female virtue or morality are referred back to the male body. Our bodies are as gold taken from your earth, and so are of a more refined birth. From that red clay where Adam did reside, precipitated and well dulcified, God took a marble pillar and did build a little world with all perfection filled. The marble pillar, as in Dubartas, is Adam's rib, but the female body, through the language of alchemy, is represented as the refinement of the male. To dulcify is to purify from acidity, to sweeten, to soften or mollify. Southwell goes further, again drawing on the Geneva commentary on Genesis 5:2, male and female created he them and blessed them and called their name Adam in the day that they were created. Quote, by giving, and the commentary is, by giving them both one name, he noteth the inseparable conjunction of man and wife. Throughout, Southwell's focus is on the equality of men and women as outlined in the scriptural account, and the way in which that authority, expressed in the sacrament of marriage, means that both share the same fate. This is the position, of course, that Adam has to arrive at in Paradise Lost. Thus, the gender divisions suggested as a willful heresy are the result of fallen human nature, not divine imperative or design. Now, Lucy Hutchinson is the writer most obviously indebted to Dubartas in terms of her conceptualization of the functions of authorship and the poetic processes of her text. Order and Disorder famously incorporates scripture as an integral mode of representation. In Book 3, the impact of Dubartas's account of prelapse error and reproduction on the basis of homology is clearly referenced. Quote, every bird and every beast its own resemblance in its female viewed, and only union with its like pursued. And a little bit further on, in union likeness only feeds delight. Animals, Hutchinson suggests, reproduce through similitude, not difference. Adam finds no such mate, an insight which is a pretext on which to base some ideas about human superiority, notions of laughter and song and so on. Quote, there was not a second of his kind endued with such a form and such a mind as might alike his soul and senses feast. And then, no meet companion, thinking them too base for the society of human race. Once again, echoing both Dubartas and Southwell, no doubt partly on account of their common scriptural sources and commentary sources, Hutchinson's Eve is made from Adam. Notably, the gendered possessive pronoun is attributed to God rather than directly applied to Eve. She is my better self, my flesh, my bone. They are, quote, late of one made two. And Hutchinson's use of the Hebrew name Isha underlines similitude. Julie Crawford's powerfully argued recent account of Hutchinson's, quote, this is Crawford's quote, indifference to any ontologically meaningful status for human sexual difference suggests that her version of the creation account is less a recuperation of Eve, who in her account indeed bears some responsibility for the fall, than a rejection of the terms of sexual differentiation upon which their unequal status rests. We might think in the discussion about Cavendish's poem of Sense and Reason and its extension of the idea of this kind of permeable boundaries between apparently distinct states and entities, and this fits in nicely with what Matt was talking about, I think. Okay, so just to kind of sum up where my thinking is going with this, I think too often we've assumed that women have read Genesis through the dyadic model of sexual differentiation upon which patriarchal thought depends, even where we've read women's interpretations as resisting that or trying to overturn it. Rather, I'd like to suggest women poets demonstrate an investment in a much more complex, fluid and mobile notion of gender that asserts that women's authority derives not from the body, but from their shared and equal humanity. Thank you.